good afternoon, everyone joining us online, and welcome to today's event on the European Critical Raw Materials Regulation, Opportunities and Challenges for Stakeholders. This is an event co-hosted by the Circular Innovation Lab and the Institute for European Environmental Policy, or IEP for short. My name is Elena Blotz. I'm a senior policy analyst at IEP, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. So before we jump into the discussion, I want to share some practical information on this event. So firstly, this is being recorded and it will be published on the Circular Innovation Lab website within a few days. There's also going to be an outcome document summarizing and highlighting the ways forward discussed in today's event. So stay tuned for when that's out, to revise what was really discussed today. So the agenda for today's event, we have, first of all, a fantastic lineup of speakers planned. I'll soon hand over the floor to George Morsdorf from DG GROW for a keynote presentation on the Critical Raw Materials Regulation, which will also highlight the role for circularity within the scope of the regulation. Afterwards, we will have a panel discussion with 4 experts working on critical raw materials and circularity to discuss the implications of the Critical Raw Materials Regulation for stakeholders. After the panel, we have a bit of time foreseen for a Q&A with our speakers. So please, stay with us until the end of the event. You'll have a chance to ask all of our speakers your questions and, have a lively discussion. We encourage you to post your questions in the dedicated Zoom Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. But if you also happen to have any information that you'd like to share with other audience members, such as upcoming events or relevant reports, please share those comments in the Zoom chat box. So that way we're differentiating between questions for the panel and interesting information for all of us here looking to discuss critical raw materials. All right, that's the main technicalities I wanted to get over with. So as you know, today we're here to discuss something very timely, just a month after the European Commission published the Critical Raw Materials Regulation on the 16th of March. So we know that the global demand for critical raw materials is rising, and it will continue to grow as many developed nations seek to decarbonize their economies. For the EU, being a net importer and relying on a handful of countries for the supply of critical raw materials, this could potentially put the risk of delivering the European Green Deal, could put the delivery of the European Green Deal at risk. So that's why the European Critical Raw Materials Regulation comes at such a important time. And we know that the regulation aims to secure a diversified and sustainable supply of critical raw materials. I won't go further into depth on this. I'd like to hand the floor over to George Morsdorf, who is a policy officer working on raw materials, energy-intensive industries, and hydrogen at DG GROW. He'll be giving us a brief presentation on the Critical Raw Materials Regulation. So, George, I hand the floor over to you, and let's have the presentation shared on screen.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Aline, and thanks for inviting me to give a bit the overview of what we've proposed. So waiting for the slides to come up. Exactly, thanks a lot. So what we propose is a regulation, but it's important to note there's also a communication explaining the overall narrative of our raw material strategy, how we want to work together with international partners, how we want to work on skills, research and innovation, and so the more non-regulatory sides, just important to keep that in mind. But I'll focus here on the regulatory part. So on the next slide, we see the main motivations, namely, on the one hand, as Aline already referred to, the Green Deal, so the green and also the digital transition, the twin transition as we call it, and the defense needs that have recently increased due to the war in Ukraine. For all that, we'll need a lot more of certain raw materials. We have a list of 34 raw materials that we identify as critical based on a scientific methodology. and a subset of those, which we call strategic raw materials, that our efforts will focus on. And for those, we see this huge increase of demand that for one of them, lithium, we can see here on the left side, both in the EU, the demand is increasing, but also global competition is increasing a lot. And on the right side, we see just how concentrated some of these value chains are. So for rare earths and the magnets value chain, that it then is used later in wind turbine generators or electric vehicle motors. We just see China dominating the whole supply chain. In many cases, it's China. In other cases, it might be other countries. We're really trying to take that seriously, make sure, especially in the context of the supply disruptions we've seen in COVID, that doesn't hamper our downstream industries. So this is what it's all about, what motivates us. On the next slide, we see then the ambition, namely to ensure a secure and sustainable supply for the Union. And there's 4 dimensions to be kept in mind. First of all, strengthening the European value chain, so producing more domestically, that's one part, along all stages, from extraction to processing and ultimately recycling. But then also within what we cannot produce domestically, we realize that will be the majority of what we consume still imports. We want to diversify those imports. That's notably our trade engagement that will contribute to those targets. Third, we in being aware of these risks, we want to help companies prepare for disruptions, so monitor those supply chains better, mitigate risks by pooling expertise in the Commission and member states. And finally, as far as possible, we really want to maximize the circularity potential, take now the decisions that then maybe in 10, 20 years will really lead to circularity, bringing up a big part of our demands. Which of course in itself leads to higher sustainability, but also other measures are meant to make what we import still from primary sources more sustainable. So that's all in some way dealt with in the proposal. Those are our objectives. On the next slide, we see the overarching framework, namely setting priorities. I've already explained critical raw materials and then the subset of strategic raw materials. The benchmarks are the targets we set ourselves to achieve by 2030, namely extraction, where we are rather conservative in terms of saying we want to produce much more, probably than 10%. We're quite a bit below that. So this is already ambitious, but we can be much more ambitious at the processing stage because we have some capacities already in the EU. And this is often the stage of the value chain where the biggest bottlenecks exist. For example, lithium is extracted all around the world, a lot in Chile, as is known, but then it goes to China for refining. And so especially that stage of the value chain, we think we can address in the next decade. And on recycling, these 15%, which might seem cautious, but is actually quite ambitious if you compare it with current rates. And of course, then a decade later or so, we could really see a big portion of our demand coming from secondary sources. And accompanying that is a diversification benchmark of not more than 65% coming from a single third country. On the next slide, we see the critical raw materials. I think the formatting is a bit messed up, but basically the idea was just to show you which ones are the raw materials that we cover. So I won't go more into detail on that, but there's a methodology underlining that. The next slide is then on strategic projects, which is really the core instrument we have at our disposal to change the situation. The proposal outlines a process by which project promoters can apply to get the status of strategic project. They will then be checked based on certain criteria. First of all, contributing to the benchmarks, so increasing our security of supply. Second, sustainability, very important. We have a whole annex outlining along which dimensions we understand sustainability, and by which means you can prove as a project promoter that you fulfill them. And then, of course, technical feasibility to have a focus. And finally, having cross-border benefits such that it's really a European project rather than a national project or a project in a third country, which we would also support with this status. Once you obtain the status, there are certain benefits bound to it. You get a priority status under national and EU law for administrative and judicial procedures. There will be a one-stop shop. There are certain permitting timelines. This is really meant to address one of the main barriers that we identified, namely permitting. And accompanying that is a process that we call enabling conditions, which is mainly about financing. So to bring all the relevant players in terms of public funds, but also then private banks into a room to be able to discuss how to make those strategic projects actually work also financially. On exploration, that's maybe also one small topic to mention, that of course everything begins with understanding what materials we have in our ground. This has been not so much invested into over the past decades, so we want to really reinvigorate that such that in due time we will see the results. On the next slide are the measures we propose on monitoring and risk mitigation. I'll be rather short here. So it's about pooling the resources, the expertise, getting companies also to do audits, at least large companies, of the supply risks in their value chains, such that they can take precautions privately, but also on coordinating strategic stockpiles for a crisis case. The next slide is then about circularity and sustainability, which I think for this event is of the greatest interest. So we really want to be ambitious on this, push up the recycling rates as much as possible. How do we do this? We oblige member states to create a program of measures relevant to increasing circularity, so increasing collection rates, just recognizing what is within the national competence. Of course, we also have, for example, proposed already a year and a half ago, the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation, which is very relevant at the EU level. So getting all levels to work on that. Also on procurement of secondary raw materials, there's something in there. Extractive waste is a priority. So rather than opening new mines, which we'll also have to do looking at the demand, let's at least try to maximize the potential we can get from old mines, where in many cases maybe iron ore has been exploited, but not all the critical raw materials that often co-occur with iron. And especially on permanent magnets, which contain rare earths, one of the most critical raw materials, to increase the recycling rates there by getting them out of the products and recycling them in a dedicated way. But also, for example, in the non-regulatory part, we say we'll work a lot on increasing recycling technologies, because they are often also not adapted to those rare critical materials. And then away from circularity, but to sustainability more generally, we have defined in this proposal a way to get a certification scheme recognized. What is a sustainable mining project? To have like a common language around that, and to have that maybe internationally as a standard. And finally, on environmental footprint, that raw materials imported into the EU, once there is an actual methodology for doing that, they would be obliged to show that footprint along different dimensions. It could be carbon, it could be water, biodiversity impacts, and so on. That is shown to the consumers to enable these sustainable choices, which we believe will also create a certain willingness to pay for more sustainable raw materials. Potentially, those would also be domestic, so there might be a double benefit from that. So that's all what's contained in the proposal in terms of instruments. Of course, yeah, we're looking forward to the negotiations with the co-legislators, maybe refining a few things there, and hoping that then indeed we can really get towards those targets, increase our security of supply and our sustainability. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, George. It's a nice presentation, really summarizing the main contents of the critical raw materials regulation, and especially like the special note to the end on circularity. So thanks for that. And I'd say let's move on to our panel discussion. Let's talk a little bit about what the critical raw material means, what the critical raw materials regulation means for stakeholders, potential opportunities and challenges. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we have Aman Chitkara. He is the Director, Government Relations of Europe and the Middle East and Africa at Li-Cycle. The Li-Cycle is a lithium-ion battery recycling company. We also have Apurva Arya, who is the CEO at Circular Innovation Lab. Another panelist we have is Patrick Schroeder. He is a senior research fellow working on Environment and Society program at Chatham House. And then finally, we have my colleague Antoine Auger, who is the head of global challenges and SDGs at IEEP. So without further ado, my first question is going to be for Aman. So the European Critical Raw Materials Regulation highlights the new recycling and recycled content targets for critical raw materials. Could you tell us a bit more about the role of the lithium battery recycling industry in contributing to the objectives of the ECRMR? I might use that interchangeably to substitute the length of the full name, but Aman, please tell us a bit more.
Sure thing, and thank you so much first for the introduction, and thank you, George, for the wonderful presentation. I think, as you mentioned, the battery supply chain is, of course, a key driver for demand growth of several different critical raw materials: lithium, nickel, manganese, natural graphite. Battery-grade versions of these materials, of course, are also listed as strategic raw materials in the critical raw materials regulation. Lithium Li-Cycle, as a lithium battery recycling and resource recovery company, works with all different types of lithium batteries to be able to recycle and recover all of these critical materials and put them back into the battery supply chain. I want to highlight a recent study that was put out by Systemic. It was called the Critical Raw Materials for Energy Transition in the EU, which talked about how a significant portion of EU's demand for these critical raw materials could be met through recycling, while, of course, technological innovation and substitution in terms of chemistries, or potentially even reduction in the use of some of these materials may continue, as is the nature. By 2050, the study expects that 65% of cobalt and about 77% of lithium consumed in the EU will come from secondary sources. Much of this, of course, will be through the recycling of end-of-life batteries as well as manufacturing waste, which, as you might all know, is a key source of feedstock for the lithium battery recycling industry. Li-Cycle, for example, processed about 20% of our feedstock was essentially manufacturing waste. The rest of the 80% coming from end-of-life batteries from vehicles, from portable batteries, as well as from stationary energy storage projects. To be able to recover these materials and put them back into the battery supply chain, of course, it requires quite a lot of processing and technological deployment. And I think policymakers are also rightly recognizing the need to deploy the industry and bring it to a stage where we can grow faster. And I think, again, I do want to stress on the need to be able to process manufacturing waste, which will be a key contributor to lithium battery recycling, at least for the next decade. I think based on some estimates that were put out by the Fraunhofer Institute, about 1.5 terawatt hour of battery manufacturing capacity is expected between now and 2030 in Europe. And battery manufacturing waste, everything that includes, off-spec powder to electrode cuttings, which is almost inevitable, part of battery manufacturing, will need to be recycled. And we, as a lithium battery recycling company, can recover up to 95% of lithium, cobalt, nickel in this battery material input, as well as battery manufacturing scrap, and do that in a way that's safe, that's sustainable, and of course scalable.
Thank you so much for your answer, Aman. As you mentioned, there's a very high potential for recycling lithium in these batteries, but there's also, I guess, other cogs of the machine, right? Like getting the deployment for collection, being able to, have clean energy for this process. And one of the things that you mentioned as well is, the requirements for recovery. And to move on to that, I'd actually like to turn my attention towards Apoorva, and ask the following question. So we know that products with high potential for the recycling of critical raw materials that are covered by the critical raw materials regulation will need to meet new requirements such as improved recovery, labeling, and collection schemes. So could you tell us a little bit more about the role of the member states in implementing these kinds of requirements to be able to reach these new recycling targets?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Aline, for the question. And to answer that, I'm going to quickly give you an overview of what it could mean when we talk about, improved recovery, labeling, and collection schemes. Okay, first off, it would mean, defining standards. So member states must really participate together and work on creation of really well-defined standards for these requirements. The standards of CRM should, on one hand, be flexible enough to be realistic for, member states to, have less resources and accommodate more changes in technologies, yet stringent enough to ensure that the use of these materials, is optimized and sustainable. On the other hand, there's also an aspect of ensuring compliance. So member states would, need to ensure that manufacturers and importers comply with these new recovery and recycling targets that is set with these regulations coming in. So this would also, of course, require monitoring the recovery and recycling rates of these critical raw materials, and really taking actions or really, have against, manufacturers, importers who are non-compliant, or businesses even. This would really give that message across that, this needs to be done. And this might also mean, giving them the right incentives to businesses and to really support this transition. So having a sturdy hand, but also at the same time, making sure that, there's a scenario where, they feel that they could, reach out. This industry would be supported while they're trying to ensure that, they are complying with these new recovery and recycling rates. And then, of course, when we talk about collection schemes, so member states, of course, need to establish these collection schemes for critical raw materials. They would also need to ensure that there's adequate, facilities for the collection and storage of these materials. So it could, of course, mean a lot of, investments to doing this. And also, on the other hand, would also mean that they need to communicate. There needs to be a lot of communication done from the member states to businesses and consumers to get them aware on these collection schemes that are available. We see that there are a lot of, consumer behavior shifts when this directly comes from member states, when they really tell consumers that what role they can play in, in making sure that we have these closed loop systems within a country itself. So I feel that's really important as well. And most importantly, the roles of member states across the EU to work together on working with, ensuring an harmonized approach across EU could, of course, lead to, less administrative burdens and costs, and increase the effectiveness of critical raw material policies. So there's, of course, needs to be, cooperation between member states that could take many forms. For instance, sharing best practices, ensuring there's, a lot of information on recovery and recycling rates that, exchange. When we have the new raw materials information systems, which provides a central hub for information and data on critical raw materials. This would also, make sure that there's partnerships across member states to ensure that nobody feels uncomfortable in sharing these rates, and there's transparency across EU. And then, of course, the European Innovation Partnership on Raw Materials would also bring together different stakeholders from industry, academia, and governments to really promote innovation and sustainable use of raw materials. So I really feel that the use of these establishments should really be encouraged by member states.
Thank you very much, Apurva. Yes, I mean, it sounds like there's really a fine balance to be struck between, the implementation role of the member states, but also making sure that it's done in a very sustainable manner, one that we can all agree with. I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, so, incentivizing businesses to also really get in on this new approach. And I kind of want to head back towards Aman. Because as we know, the EU, to reach the proposed targets for recycled content, is going to need to scale up today's recycling industry to meet the future demand. So can you tell us about what the recycling industry can do today and what it can't do? For example, what available technology is there? And then building on that, in what ways does the critical raw materials regulation help the industry where it needs to be? So can you shed some light on that?
Sure thing. I'll try to answer that question. There's a lot to unpack there. I think in terms of the technology, there are a few key pathways to recycling end-of-life batteries as well as other battery material input. There's the hydrometallurgical route. There's the pyrometallurgical route, where you burn these batteries and try to extract materials from slags and alloys. And then, of course, there's the mechanical shredding or the dismantling or disassembly route. Usually, companies employ some mix of these different pathways. Li-Cycle's technology allows us to be able to mechanically shred these batteries without first having to disassemble or dismantle these batteries, which, of course, can be time-saving as well as safe. And then process the black mass, which is the output that you get from shredding these batteries, after having, of course, removed aluminum, copper, plastics, and then using a hydrometallurgical process where, of course, you use a number of different solvents to be able to extract all the different critical materials in batteries sequentially. In the pyrometallurgical process as well, there is going to be some combination of shredding the battery or crushing the battery or burning the battery and then trying to extract all of these materials. The advantage of our process, of course, is that one, there's minimal wastewater discharge, there's minimal solid waste that's generated. You can achieve really high efficiency rates and recovery rates. And of course, the overall safety and sustainability of the process is fairly high. I think what we're seeing across the industry is that we've moved past the stage of research and development. We at Li-Cycle, of course, have been running our spokes for the last several years. Spokes is the first part of our recycling process where we mechanically shred these batteries. And then the hub is where we essentially deploy the hydrometallurgical process to be able to extract materials from that black mass. We've been running these spokes in a commercial setting for the last couple of years. We've tested the hub itself at a pilot stage. We've tested material output with several different commercial partners, as well as with third-party verifiers and labs. And we feel confident in our ability, of course, to be able to scale that to an industrial level. I can go into more details about that, but I think the baseline message here for policymakers is that the recycling industry is ready to build to the levels that we need to be able to reach the benchmarks that the Critical Raw Materials Act is specifying. We don't need to spend money towards research and development. we can essentially target funding towards sustainable, safe, industrial scale battery recycling projects. Given the fact that site selection, closing of finance, getting all your permits in order, and of course, then purchasing the equipment, installing the equipment, and getting the facility up and running to meet the requirements that the Critical Raw Materials Act and the battery regulation, which is another piece of regulation that just came out earlier this year, it takes a long time. And I think the need to be able to start deploying battery recycling capacity right now is of the essence. We cannot waste more time and wait and sit around before we actually start deploying battery recycling at the scale at which is needed. As I said before, there is a significant amount of battery manufacturing scrap that needs to be recycled already. So even if we think about the fact that, battery end-of-life batteries will be a significant source of feedstock for the battery recycling industry only after 2030, there is still a significant amount of battery manufacturing waste and scrap that needs to be recycled today. And for that, we need to be able to deploy that capacity today. What's needed, and I appreciate that you asked that question, because I think the Critical Raw Materials Regulation already sets the ambition fairly high in terms of high benchmarks for the amount of recycled critical raw materials that we want to achieve within the EU or through capacity that's deployed within the EU. But then the battery regulation also sets several other targets for the battery recycling industry in terms of recycling efficiency, in terms of recovery rates, in terms of carbon footprint disclosure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think with all of those ambitions, benchmarks, and targets taken together, there is quite a lot of anticipation in the industry. And I think we now need to move beyond and just deliver on those ambitions. And again, time is of the essence. Of course, the COVID pandemic, the supply chain crisis, and most recently, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine have precipitated the need to be able to deploy capacity with an urgency that's never been seen before. All of this, of course, coupled with the need to transition quickly towards a decarbonized economy, means that we need to be able to source as much secondary raw materials from or raw materials for the battery supply chain from secondary sources as possible. And there are a few things that we at Lifecycle have talked about. And again, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the battery regulation already start talking about these things. The first is the need to be able to accelerate permitting for sustainable strategic projects. The Critical Raw Materials Regulation talks about several measures through, of course, the Critical Raw Materials Board and what member states can do in terms of first verifying whether certain projects meet those criteria and then helping them secure those permits at an expedited speed. So again, lots of good ideas there. The next step will be in terms of ensuring that that delivery takes shape according to those ambitions. The second key part, of course, is ensuring that we have set those high targets for the industry to orient itself around. And there again, I think we have visibility, we have the go-ahead. Delivery is going to be the key, and ensuring that those targets stay or are sustainable would be absolutely essential. Which brings me to my third point, and probably the most important, which is the need for public finance. Given the fact that battery recycling, of course, is quite a capital-intensive industry, and the industry itself is at relatively early stage in its deployment, I think the need for public finance to be able to mutualize the risk of investments so that the battery recycling industry can grow to a stage where we can essentially secure a sustainable and resilient supply of critical raw materials is absolutely essential. And here, the important thing to note is not just the quantum of public finance, but also the process through which we access public finance, whether it's in the form of tax credits, grants, loans. I think we need to be able to ensure that, one, it is accessible for innovative players such as ourselves, who are still growing quite rapidly, to be able to access that funding. And I think there is a case to be made for a stage gate approach, instead of, you apply now and you hear 1 year from now whether you got the money or not, after having invested a significant amount of time, money, and investments into the application process. So thinking a little bit about the process, thinking about the eligibility and which projects can apply for that money. And of course, also thinking about, what the long-term outlook on the availability of that public finance might look like, given, of course, that you are going to be developing projects in a sequential manner. It's not just now. So I think those are the key things that policymakers may want to think about going forward.
Yes, thank you so much, and very, well summarized and concise. So I thank you very much for those points. So yeah, it sounds like, the technology is there, but there's still some hurdles to really upscale the industry, such as, availability and processes for public financing, as well as permitting, regulatory barriers, and the like. So yeah, hopefully, with the strategic projects, these types of industries can see, the growth that is necessary to reach the targets, in a way that we would like to see that happen sustainably, of course. So we've talked a lot about the role of recycling in the context of the critical raw materials regulation. But of course, recycling is only one end of the value chain. And to have a full circular approach, we'd like to look at, also the upstream section of the value chain. So with that, I'd actually like to turn to our next panelist, Patrick. And I'd like to ask if you could highlight how circular economy measures, going beyond just recycling, could actually complement the objectives of the critical raw materials regulation. So Patrick, please, over to you.
Yes, hello. Thanks, Aline. Yeah, first also, yeah, thanks for inviting me to join the panel today. The topic of critical raw materials is gaining a lot of interest, and not only from a sustainability perspective, but there's also trade dimensions related to it, or geopolitics. So quite a number of angles to look at it. And one thing to start off with, maybe, that the EU publishing the strategy in March, maybe by coincidence, the UK government actually published an update on their strategy documents relating to CRMs. So it's called the Critical Minerals Refresh, and this was to reinforce the UK government's commitment for the critical mineral strategy from 2022. And then obviously the US Department of Energy published the strategy, I think, already back in 2021. So now we have all these frameworks in place, which is good to see. And it's also good to see that in all these strategies, the role of circular solutions is highlighted, mostly about recycling. So the EU target of 15% is a very specific target, which, for example, the UK doesn't have. There's also the recycled content target for permanent magnets, which is relevant. But from our perspective, the recycling, although it's important, that we can actually do more, and we can have more ambitious circular solutions. If we look at the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, for example, there's a range of other policy initiatives underway, and these can be useful to reduce demand and create more resilience. Specifically, I would mention eco-design requirements for products which are heavily reliant on critical raw materials. And these products need to become more durable, repairable, and recyclable, obviously, but also they need to be incentivized for repair and remanufacture. And there's a couple of policies which are also quite new, which are important in this context. And one I wanted to highlight is the EU's right to repair legislation, which was again also published in March. So there's some interesting things in there, and it's very consumer focused. So giving consumers new rights, have more options for easier and cheaper repair of products, which can be technically repaired. And it links also to the issues of guarantees. So often no repair is possible or very expensive if the warranty is expired, but this new right to repair legislation changes that. So producers will be required to repair products 5 to 10 years after purchase. That will probably depend on which specific product. And so this is quite important because it's changing a paradigm of planned obsolescence, especially for consumer electronics. I think is quite a game changer. The legislation also mentions a European repair standard to be developed. So it's not a complete set of policy that's already in place, but under development. And then again, important to mention would also be what's happening in the US, especially on state level. There are similar right to repair legislations being put in place. In 2022, state of New York enacted the first digital right to repair law. And then early this year in Colorado and in Maine, Consumer Right to Repair Agricultural Equipment Act, for example, one. And in Maine, a right to repair referendum is being held. So quite a lot of activity across the Atlantic as well. Now, the other regulation that was also mentioned by George at the beginning, the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation. I think that's a really important one to look at. So which is going to replace the existing Eco-Design regulation. And the objective is to make sustainable products the norm in the EU. And it's also connected to the Circular Electronics Initiative. And I would say these are like key policy initiatives for enabling a circular economy for electronics. So the new aspect of this is that the eco-design focus on energy efficiency performance of products. Then the revision of the eco-design regulations will add in material efficiency criteria. So, and that will then promote longer product lifetimes and based on circular design principles. Interestingly, also there are already standards that were developed by the two official European standard organizations, CEN and CENELEC. So there's 8 standards which were published in 2029 and 2020. And these standards include specific methods for extending product lifetime, methods for reuse of components, etc. And one of these standards is specifically about the declaration of the use of critical raw materials in electronic products. Well, these standards are not yet mandatory. They set very much the technical criteria, and how this develops will be interesting to look at. At the moment, there's another consultation for the updated Eco-Design Directive, and it'd be interesting to see which of these standards might become mandatory in the process. It becomes even more interesting when we look at potential design standards for renewable energy equipment, batteries, but also, for example, solar PV panels or wind turbine equipment, all of which also using critical raw materials. I'll just stop here for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you as well for also highlighting, not only what's going on in terms of the, the EU, the ESPR and the right to repair, but also what's going on in America, because EU is obviously not an island on its own. Great. I'd like to now turn to my colleague Antoine, because we talked about how these circular economy policies can improve material efficiency, product design, and extend product life cycles. And these are all ways to reduce the demand for raw materials. But going further than that, Antoine, can you tell us more about how demand-side mitigation measures could reduce both dependency on third countries and also the need to upscale extraction within the EU? And building on that, what are the potential implications of these kinds of targets, these demand-side mitigation measure targets? What potential implications could there be for trade partner countries of the EU? So Antoine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eline, and hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Yes, indeed, we've seen already a number of angles for which to tackle the use of critical raw materials in the EU and all over the world. There are already so many angles to consider, whether downstream or upstream. So I hope you'll pardon me for bringing yet another one that we feel is somewhat, I wouldn't say, somewhat missing in the European critical raw material regulation as it has been published so far. And these are the demand-side mitigation measures. We believe at AEP that these are a key part of a balanced approach of the use of critical raw materials, and so that they should be considered adequately. Eventually, so we've seen a number of benchmarks and targets in the ECRMR on recycled content or domestic extraction capacities and so on. And we would have loved to see some more targets relating to material use reduction, for instance. These are a very concrete way to introduce these sort of conceptions into the regulation. I would like to highlight on this that the latest IPCC report, for instance, actually documents relatively well how demand-side mitigation measures can be absolutely key in participating to the efforts to reducing our material footprint. It talks in terms of the end-use technology adoption, not necessarily just downstream, where products containing CRMs are absolutely prominent, such as our phones, or cars, or vehicles, or electric vehicles, and the like. So IPCC reports provide examples on nutrition and electricity use, for instance, which are quite, let's say, the most obvious one, but also in sectors such as the industrial productions, the transport, or buildings, where this end-use technology, and so the use of products containing CRMs, and so how the reduction of demand and of consumption of these products could actually be a very key part of the effort. So this is to say that now consumption target measures, demand-side targeted measures that were up until recently not very part of the public debate are now actually very scientifically covered and demonstrated. So these are now should be part of our legislative proposal as such. So first of all, this is from a climate perspective, of course, but also if we take it from a strategic perspective, this is one of the easiest way to address our dependency, to address all of the bottlenecks that we have from when we are import dependent on other countries for certain CRMs. Reducing our demand, reducing our consumption is a direct way to address such bottleneck, and so has a very, very strategic importance for the EU. One thing for me to keep in mind also is such measures, if we assume that they would be put in place, would have a very much impact on third countries that are dependent on the exports of the critical raw materials. If we reduce our demand, we reduce their capacities for export. This could have environmentally positive consequences, such as because we know that extractive processes in third countries can sometimes be much more environmentally detrimental, let's say, and it's not abide to the same standards that can be in place in the EU. But this can also have socially destructive consequences when a lot of countries and populations could depend on the export of materials, and countries might lack the alternatives to compensate for the lack of export potential of these CRMs. So the introduction of these demand-side mitigation measures in the EU, it's critical that they are accompanied by measures, efforts, support given to third countries to upscale their own domestic processing capacities in order to increase the value addition, to increase the value added in these countries, and so that to mitigate, to compensate the export of virgin materials through already processed products containing their own, let's say, CRMs. So that is, to me, an absolutely critical aspect of the ECRMR. And there are ways to do that. For instance, the notion of strategic projects that is introduced by the ECRMR, we know that this strategic project can be based in third countries. This is something that the legislation caters for. So we could perfectly imagine this strategic project and an upscaling capacity for domestic processing in a third country being supported by the regulation, and thus participating to that particular effort. So, of course, I've seen in the chat already that there were questions relating to this as to how to prioritize these capacities. This depends on a number of factors, obviously, and notably the access you have to these primary products that could then be reprocessed, whether it's mining waste, whether it's the actual critical raw material, the virgin material, or whether it is what you already have in certain countries, some recycling or processing industries or capacities that could be easily repurposed. So these are all aspects to consider, but again, the combination of demand-side mitigation measures in the EU with efforts in certain countries to move them up, to be moving up the value chains into more value addition and domestic processing of critical materials, to me is absolutely key.
Thank you very much, Antoine. And thank you so much for highlighting as well, like the potential opportunities for our trade partner countries, that they're still there, even if we, within the EU, some stakeholders would like to advocate for these demand side mitigation measures to, decrease our overall material consumption footprint. While we're talking on the spillover potential impacts of the ECRMR on trade partners, we know that the regulation proposes a new target to limit the sourcing of one critical raw material from just one trade partner. Inevitably, this will impact some of our existing trade flows and consequently stakeholders in third countries. So Apurva, I'd like to actually turn to you and ask you, what kind of challenges will stakeholders in the Global South face to be compliant with the regulation? And also, are there other opportunities, to complement what Antoine has just said, other opportunities for these stakeholders that you could see?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elena, for the question. And absolutely, with a regulation such as this one, there's going to be, gains and losses for stakeholders, both in the Global South and North as well. But focusing on the South as well, we'll see that with EU trying to diversify its supply chain, we would of course see, there's going to be some countries that are going to benefit from trade flows and increased trade flows, especially like Chile, Kazakhstan, Namibia, with the aim to form the new critical raw materials club. And this would mostly be done through free trade agreements. And of course, wherein EU is trying to decrease dependency in countries such as China, for instance. Right now, 93% of EU magnesium imports and 86% of EU rare earth metal imports are from China. They would want to decrease that. So it will probably still import a lot. I imagine there's not going to be drastic changes we'll see at the very beginning, but it's slowly trying to phase out this dependency. We would see new countries benefiting from this as well. And as by 2030, the ECMR aims to have imported critical raw materials limited to 65% of demand, which is, of course, a significant decrease for the above metals. We also see, according to World Bank, it's predicted that the global demand for the critical raw materials will increase by nearly 500% by 2050. So I feel the net impact of these ECMR restrictions on raw materials imports could be minimal. But the regulation, however, could have more powerful impacts from its imitators. Patrick mentioned the US and the UK, and as these economies and trading blocks follow suit, there's going to be export of critical raw materials could even shrink further, and even demonize the Global South exporters for their resource endowments. We also see that internally processing secondary goods with high concentrations of ECMR would also reduce trade in secondhand goods, especially within EEE, and ELVs between the global north and the global south. So this could essentially mean there's, decreased accessibility for the global south in terms of access to technology, capital flows, and could also hinder development by increasing inequality in economic mobility and the quality of life. Would of course also impact wages, labor arrangement and such. And also talking about stakeholders in the global south, and a practical example that we see with the new EU legislation on sustainable textiles with set product specific design requirements and so on. We see a lot of SMEs that are really affected by such regulations because they do not have the kind of resources required to comply with these new labeling certification requirements. Some of the work that we did in the Philippines, a lot of these exporters also here saw these as like non-tariff barriers. And George also mentioned this before, with the increased competition for both the strategic raw materials and the critical raw materials, you would have increased prices, and this could inevitably first sting the global south. Then we also talked about how these requirements would also have this effect on stakeholders in terms of policymakers as well, who would want to have build capacity. SMEs are backbones for economies in the global south, and to also ensure this, they would need to put together a lot of these things. But in terms of opportunities, I feel gaining strategic project status could be a short-term opportunity for the global south, although in the long run, helping accomplish these ECRMR goals could aid in capital development and really build a comparative advantage in the global south for global secondary raw material needs. But I feel like what Aman also mentioned within public finance, and that's also one key aspect that needs to be looked upon at, especially in the global south when we're talking about like really building capacities, getting access to public finance, especially which kind of instruments are we talking about? Is it tax incentives? Is it loans for innovative players? It becomes even more critical, I feel, and because especially with the SMEs, as I mentioned before, because they don't have as many resources to put in like lengthy applications and have and be able to comply with the stringent certification or environmental declaration needs that would be put together. So that's also something that could be a challenge. But I think in terms of opportunities, the development of the Critical Raw Materials Club gives a new export opportunity, to less trade dominant economies in the global south. Although this is limited due to the inclusion of countries from the global north. Theoretically reduced import demand from the EU will therefore be shared between more countries, only some of which will be from the global south. And finally, this act might increase the EU-based recycling rates, meaning that countries that might have been intentionally or unintentionally importing, for example, WEEE might not now have such streams creating problems. So that said, this might also limit the EU exports of waste with any recoverable value left. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Apoorva. So yeah, it sounds like, honestly, as with many EU legislation that has that trade component, there's always a risk of these non-tariff barriers for countries in the global south. But, there are opportunities. And I think as long as, there's possibility and openness to that cooperation and that dialogue to understand these potential risks of these non-tariff barriers and these new regulations, and there's a possibility that, there are these opportunities that then materialize in the global south. I want to pick up on that notion of the Critical Materials Club, but noticing that, we have half an hour left. I have one more question for Patrick, and then we're going to be moving to the Q&A. I want to flag to our panelists that if you see any question in the Q&A box that you might want to answer, you can do so in writing. And then I'll try and sift through the questions that we have, because there's quite a few already, and then we'll get to those later. But before we do that, I'm going to move back over to Patrick and talk a bit more about this notion of critical raw materials clubs, strategic partnerships. So we see that this is being proposed in the regulation. And I guess my question to you is, how do you see this more cooperative approach playing out on an international stage, for example, with major trading partners such as the USA and China? I'd like to hear a bit of your insights on this.
Yes, thanks for the question. I mean, overall, I think there's currently more competition than cooperation in this space. I think an indication is also that the Critical Raw Materials Act was published at the same time we saw the Net Zero Industries Act being published. So from our perspective, what we've been observing is that critical raw materials are becoming more framed in terms of resource nationalist or protectionist discourse. So you could say in a way that the CRM Act and the Net Zero Industry Act are reactions to some of the industrial strategies that we've seen from the US and China. So there was the Inflation Reduction Act from the US. There's a big push for subsidies for green technologies. China has the Made in China 2025 strategy, which is also about domestic manufacturing. And then the EU in a way has reacted to this. So yeah, we don't necessarily see the cooperation between those big players at the moment. But I mean, on the positive side, the European Act, I think, is less, I'd say, protectionist than what we've seen from the US or from China. And there's more focus also on diversification of supply chain rather than emphasizing domestic manufacturing. There's also a realization that Europe cannot be self-sufficient, either in CRMs through domestic mining. So Europe has the need for these partnerships. And one point that we tried to make also in a recent article that we published, that if Europe wants to remain a global leader in the net zero transition and to drive the innovation, so Europe cannot afford to look inward or pull back from global cooperation. So that's where the Critical Raw Materials Club might come in. But at the moment, there's not that much information on the club. At least I haven't come across a lot. One point I come out, it's very much about bringing in investments. So there was talk about, for example, 20 billion have to be invested by 2030 to secure materials for batteries. There's also the Mineral Security Partnership, which was launched last year in Canada at a large meeting. And so the countries, it was launched by the US State Department, and members here include Australia, Canada, Finland, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Sweden, US, UK. So it looks like as if these clubs are mostly countries, deindustrialized countries that need to source the CRMs, but there's less mention of the countries in the global south who would be supplying it. Maybe that connects to Apurva's point. So from our perspective, we'd rather see inclusive partnerships that enable and also contribute to socioeconomic development in countries in the global south, rather than exclusive clubs that just have strategies how to secure the materials needed for domestic net zero transitions.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Very good. I am just thinking of the time. I had one more question for each of the speakers, but I think I might keep that for the end of the event and move to the Q&A now. So that will feature more as a wrap up. So let me just quickly take a look at the Q&A box, because I see George has been very active in typing out some answers to people. So thank you so much for that, George. I see one question here about aluminum not being present on the list, but I also saw that George had answered that bauxite is on the list of critical raw materials. So that should factor in to take into account for that. All right, first question here from the Ministry of Environment of Armenia, Mary. What are the main aspects that developing countries may need to balance their economic and environmental priorities when developing critical raw materials management policies? Maybe this is a good question for Apoorva and anyone else that might want to come in to answer this question. So what are developing, I guess, countries in the Global South, what are they going to need to look at when, having to manage their critical raw material supplies? Do you have any insights on that, Apoorva?
Thank you, Elena. I think just building on to some of the key things that I mentioned before, especially when putting out strategies for CRM policies and making sure that there's resource recovery. I think one aspect is to, of course, ensuring that there's within the country to ensure that there's enough capacity for the internal transition, and the rest would be to how to make sure that they have access to more markets and have access to the EU market now, especially with the new labeling and certification requirement. I already built on how to make sure that key manufacturers are looped in onto the process of building capacity. Also links with the public finance thing that was mentioned by Aman on how to make sure that you give manufacturers, businesses the right incentives to have these labeling and certification requirements in place to make sure that you're as part of from a trade perspective, from a having more access to more markets outside of your country, more competitive like that. I think that's one aspect that really needs to be built upon. And of course, the other thing is, sharing, best practices from across the globe in terms of policies that have worked and not worked from the Global South, because we just have more data points, right now from the Global South and what had worked for some countries, what doesn't, and how closely linked that policy is to your economic and local context in terms of what kind of market you are, what kind of domestic capacities you have. I think there was one question within the Q&A box that talked about there's a vast contrast between the technical capacities, the recycling recovery rates, and if that is the case, is there something that could be applicable to your context to make sure that one part of the supply chain you would most benefit from an economic point of view, whether it's recycling or recovery, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's processing, and to make sure that you are able to really build upon that. That would be my first a couple of few things that came to my mind. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And yeah, it also sounds like the strategic partnerships with particular trade partners could play a big role in, this
Absolutely.
knowledge sharing of the EU, and especially, if we want to have this these environmental priorities be a main focus, then the EU will probably also have to step in and in those partnerships to secure that as well. Thanks for that. Yes, George, please come in.
Yeah, just like also that. So we've already started working on strategic partnerships with countries, especially in the Global South, but not only. And generally, there's also like a standard set of elements that are in there, and one of them is creating value locally, helping countries move up the value chain. So it's really that model that we foresee more. And also in terms of capacity building and knowledge sharing. So what often it's the question, like, what can you deliver as the European Union, which does not have much raw materials extraction, at least not in comparison to its demand today. But we do have like quite expert, quite strong companies in the extraction technologies, so like equipment providers, which would also help to make that extraction more more sustainable, higher health protection for the workers, and so on. So that's technical capacity, but also, for example, the satellite program of the EU, Copernicus on Earth observation, that's something that is often part of this, or geological expertise in the national geological surveys that we have. So there's a lot that the EU can bring to help those companies like develop their own value chain, like along the value chain really. So it's those win-win partnerships that we're seeking. And then, of course, for the EU, what's in it is getting the secure supplies, getting maybe a foothold in terms of like also geopolitical influence. Of course, that also plays a role. So there are some that we've already negotiated, I think like 5 or 6 over the last years since our 2020 action plan, and much more to come in the pipeline.
Thanks so much for complimenting with those very concrete answers. Aman, I see you have your hand raised. You'd like to come in on this too.
Thank you.
Oh, no, we're sorry.
No,
I'm thinking...
I do. I appreciate that. So I think from a lithium battery recycler's perspective, there's not really a trade-off between economics and environment. Recycling fundamentally supports both environmental and economic goals. Environmental goals in terms of averting the need for extraction of lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese from conflict areas, from water scarce areas, from areas where native or indigenous rights might be affected, where water may be scarce, where you don't have enough labor protections. So I think from all of those perspectives, recycling does support those environmental goals, but then you can also design recycling processes in a way that are environmentally sustainable, that can support your decarbonization goals. And again, I think I would congratulate the EU here in terms of introducing digital passports that allow you to track the environmental footprint of various different products across the supply chain, including, of course, the component that recycling contributes. So I think from that point of view, I think let's reframe that discussion and not necessarily talk about a trade-off, but instead talk about how these solutions can essentially benefit both of the metrics that you're trying to improve on. I'm sorry, just one last point. I do know that I talk quite a bit about recycling, but at the end of the day, yes, I agree with all the other panelists. It's not the solution, that we will still need to depend on imports, on mining and extraction and whatnot. So back to you.
Thank you, Aman. And yeah, it's good to rephrase that as well. It doesn't necessarily need to be a trade-off, especially in the context of recycling. So thanks for highlighting that. Antoine, over to you, but please let's try and keep it a little concise.
Yes, thank you, Helene. Sorry about that. Just to mention, as part of the cooperation and sort of the trade flows and trade channels that that are currently developed, just to mention the free trade agreements. Apologies, this has been mentioned already, but we know that the EU is engaged in a flurry of FTA negotiations that are very relevant for CRMs, the supply of CRMs. We've just concluded negotiation with Chile. We're engaged with Mexico, Australia, and others expected to be concluded this year. So that's. As part of the FTAs, of course, there are the cooperation mechanisms that are foreseen, especially in the trade and sustainable development chapters, on which the use and the kind of support, the technology transfers that are needed to upscale the capacities, the domestic capacities of such countries could be discussed. But also I wanted to mention the direct provisions in an FTA that could be relevant to secure access to the technologies, to the tires, to the product, to the services that would be needed for upscaling these domestic capacities and thereby expanding the processing capacities throughout the world, eventually making our use of CRMs containing product more sustainable.
Sorry, I just accidentally muted myself. Thank you, Antoine, for adding that perspective as well from the trade angle. Good. Yeah, there's so many questions. It's hard to pick out one, but I do see one on extended producer responsibility, which I do think makes a lot of sense to talk about since we mentioned, collection, recovery, circularity. And so, maybe I can ask Patrick. So one question we have is, can extended producer responsibility be used to push critical raw materials management? I'm sure the answer to that, I'm sure, is yes, it can. Maybe you can share more insights on potential issues that have already arose with EPR schemes currently, and yeah, maybe some reflections on that.
Yes, good question. I mean, EPR for electronics and e-waste, for example, could be, I think they're quite closely linked. So there are many countries are implementing EPRs. Europe has these EPRs. Yeah, I haven't actually thought through how that would link specifically now, but I mean, potentially to the point that Aman made also earlier on how to finance, for example, where do you get investments for recycling capacities or for recycling facilities? I think EPR could be potentially a vehicle for that. I actually maybe I can also hand over the question to Apurva, or the answer, because I know there's been, I think even in cooperation with IEP, because you've been looking at a cross-border EPR, how it could work to finance then also recycling outside of Europe. I'm not sure if Apurva, if you want to add something on that.
Yes, absolutely, Patrick. And maybe just to first give a context about, EPR and how it's working so far, especially between at the EEE level, is to say that a lot of barriers to having recycling or recovery rates that the EU is not able to fulfill within EU is seen as, for instance, trading those secondhand goods to emerging economies. We see a lot of secondhand electronic EEE goods from EU to Africa, and that's also one of the studies that we looked into. We saw that there's a lot of loopholes within the EPR that exist at the moment, whether it's the monitoring of whether a EEE or a EEE is qualified enough to be a secondhand good that's traded, whether it's even the definition of a EEE and a EEE is really hard to distinguish from, which leads to all these negative ways of dealing with these EEEs, which is also kind of an illegal dumping situation that we saw in the case of Africa. But really touching upon it from a CRMI perspective, if you see extended producer responsibility, you also see that a lot of the EPR fees that's collected within EU to ensure the environmental safe management of these products really does not follow through when secondhand goods are imported outside of the EU. So you also have that problem there. If we talk about the critical raw materials, I spoke about this before, like with this legislation of, doing internal recovery and recycling within the EU, it would increase, a lot of costs for businesses. It might deem it, really difficult for them to manage it like that. So that's also one aspect that I'm thinking through about, what would it mean for businesses? What would it mean for them to, because the only reason that, you're doing recovering and recycling outside of the EU is because of the cost. It's because of the cheap labor costs, it's the cheap infrastructure access and so on and so forth. So that is also one aspect that within the CRM, that would be super interesting to see how that is managed within EU. It could obviously would mean that the member states need to, really really make sure that there's enough financing to make sure that, the recovery and recycling within the EU is beneficial for businesses. It makes economic sense to do within the EU, and that would be a major challenge, I feel, especially and would really mean not just public finance, but also in terms of infrastructure, in terms of which member state would have the capacity to have these big infrastructures. Then again comes the question of cooperation between member states. So within EU, this would really more encourage them and literally force them to work together, which is a good thing, I feel, to ensure that there is more capacity within the EU to make sure that we have recovery and recycling rates. Yeah, I mean, those are like some of the few things that came to my mind, but happy if anyone else on the panel wants to think through this. This was just me firing off.
Thanks, Apurva and Patrick. Really good. I'd like to encourage all of our speakers to maybe take another look at the Q&A. We still have a lot of questions and definitely nowhere near the amount of time to get through them all. So if you happen to see one you'd like to answer, please do so by typing an answer. I have a question I'd like to first direct to George, and then maybe, Apurva, if it sounds like you might want to say something about that. It's from Filipa about the possibility of designing CRM requirements based on recycling processing capacities. So, we see that in member states, there's different capacities to actually do this recycling and processing. And I guess the question is how do we optimize processes without excluding those that are more limited in terms of capacity? So I don't know if George, maybe you have a perspective from DG Grow on how this is foreseen in the CRMR, and then maybe Apurva, if you'd like to complement a little bit after that.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm not 100% sure I got the reasoning of the question, but I think it's important to keep in mind most critical raw materials are really like small volume markets. So often, and that is also precisely the reason that recycling rates are pretty low for most of them. Because they're distributed in alloys, small parts of a very complex technical product, and then taking them out and having that critical mass for it to actually be economical to recycle it is often really the challenge. And so, I mean, that's why really the EU single market is a big asset, because we can say, well, we don't need every member state to have one gallium recycling plant. It probably makes sense to have one or two across the EU. And so that's what I would say, like that it's not really like a member state specific point here, but like across the EU, we will need some processing capacities wherever project developers find the most efficient way to do it, linking to where the waste streams come from, but also where there is know-how and all that. And then, of course, that could be a strategic project that could benefit from accelerated permitting. And then from finance, which will of course depend on. So we set with our process like the framework for that finance. There is no actual like pot of money in the proposal, but of course then different funds, and I think maybe that links also to what was being discussed before on strategic projects in third countries. Of course, there then the development and global engagement funds could become relevant. Of course, they all have their own rules, but the idea is by identifying these strategic projects, then we can really focus our efforts on it, and then have a higher likelihood to actually get those projects over the finish line, let's say. So maybe I drifted off a bit from the aim of the question, but I think that's what I can say on this.
Thank you. Apurva, please, we'd love to hear your thoughts too.
I think George really covered it well. I think a little thing that I would want to add into, and also something that Patrick mentioned earlier about the inclusivity aspect of it, and it shouldn't be like they're just countries and economies that have specific capacities that should only be having gains through this. I think that could be one thing that the Commission can make sure doesn't happen, is to ensure that there's it's a win-win situation both for the global north and the global south, because it shouldn't be about just economies trying to have their domestic needs meet especially for the energy transition. I think the critical raw materials are really critical in the moving forward for economies for the energy transition, and if there are countries that are left behind due to this, it might be much of a challenge, especially these resource rich economies who could face the brunt of not being able to manage their resources well at this point of time, with the global north really pushing on to economies in the global north that don't have access or any domestic capacities for critical raw materials. So I feel that is one aspect that from the Commission that can ensure that there could be CRM requirements, whether it's the Critical Raw Materials Club or the strategic projects. There needs to be more inclusivity, and needs to ensure that such economies are not left behind, the ones with less capacities. That's all.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you really to all the panelists for participating in the Q&A. I am afraid that we're going to have to wrap up the Q&A session. But before we say goodbye for good, I have one last question for all of my speakers to kind of, think about, where do we go from here? So to all my speakers, my last question is, in your view, what is the most important next step to ensure that the EU meets its demand for critical raw materials in a circular economy compatible manner? So I want to ask you all also to be as concise as possible, really like a few sentence wrap up from each speaker. So maybe I can hand over to, George, I see you unmuted. Would you also want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, let's say getting this legislation passed as soon as possible, that would be helpful.
Very concise, very good. Aman, let's hear from you.
Just going to echo George on that front. Nothing more to add.
Okay, perfect. Patrick?
Yes, maybe I wanted to highlight a point that Antoine made at the beginning. Think again about the demand, because we have these projections about the demand in lithium, the demand in other materials. These are not necessarily givens. So I think the EU we need to do more thinking about actually how do we reduce those projected demand, the growth. So that should be like a key element, in addition to, in combination with circular material use, and obviously securing supplies with new trading partners. But I think that's an important part of the mix to achieve resilience. And I think we can go further in ambition in this respect.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think definitely with this event we've highlighted, how these demand side measures could contribute to resilience and securing these supply chains. Apurva, I saw you unmuted yourself, so I'll hand over to you first and then to Antoine.
All right. I'm gonna make it really quick. I think first, just adding on to what George had mentioned, is to figure out what this legislation means for different member states. Is also the first step in making sure that we pass it. But I think apart from that, strengthening cooperation among member state and its stakeholders and the importing nations, to promote transparency, traceability of CRM is going to be key. And for this, of course, it would be sharing best practices, common transparency and standards must be established. And I feel like knowledge sharing is so essential for a circular economy. So I would stop here. I think those are the key things that we need to first figure out going into this.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. And Antoine.
Thank you. Yes, to echo what Patrick has just said, to introduce some demand-side mitigation measures in the ECRM Act, so that we actually do not follow up the projected increase in demand, or actually not to that scale. That we still leave the industry and private sector and all relevant actors with a very, very potentially profitable sector to operate in. So we just want to make sure that this is also part of the picture. But of course, this combined again with supporting the capacity of those countries to upscale the domestic capacities. This can be done through, I've mentioned, through FTA provisions for access to relevant products, services, and technology transfer, including for such domestic capacities, regular cooperation, including regulatory cooperation, to make sure that we operate around the same standards that are possible to be met by third countries. Technical assistance, and I will end up with financial assistance, giving them, the third countries, the means to actually do that. For me, is absolutely key.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Looks like we've made it to 3:30, so let's officially wrap up the event. I want to thank all of our speakers for being so brilliant today and, cooperating really well with all of these questions. I also want to thank the organizing teams from IEP side, but also from the Circular Innovation Lab, of course. And thank you to all of the participants, for asking so many questions. It's been it's been a lot, but it's been great. Stay tuned. The recording of this event will be available in a few days on the Circular Innovation Lab website. And then also in a few weeks, there will be as I mentioned at the beginning, a way forward document. So summarizing the outcomes and highlighting, the main discussion points of this event. So that's going to be really nice to, refresh in a few weeks' time. Thank you, everyone, for joining.